Okay, that was a fantastic start. Welcome everybody to the last event of our fantastic CSLC 2020 Symposium. We would like to once again welcome everybody who is here. Say another great thank you to our sponsors, which I will now read. It is USC's Departments of American Studies and Ethnicity, Cinema and Media Studies, Comparative Literature, East Asian Languages and Cultures, English, French and Italian, Latin American and Iberian Cultures, and Slavic Languages and Literatures, as well as the Francophone Research and Resource Center, Graduate Student Government, the Levin Institute for Humanities, the Max Kade Institute for Austrian, German, Swiss Studies, the Visual Studies Research Institute, and finally, of course, the Comparative Studies in Literature and Cultural Doctoral Program. But, of course, and especially also a giant thank you to all of the graduate students that put this whole event together. As Edie and Jane said at the beginning of, before the keynote yesterday, it's been such a pleasure to organize this and put everything together with you all. So another special shout out to Edie and Nina, to Ran, to Adam, to Aaron, to Jane, to Nora, and to Cord-Heinrich. That is us two who will be sort of facilitating this roundtable discussion. And also I would like to once again restate our solidarity as grad students at USC with the cost of living adjustment protests in the UC system. As was mentioned yesterday already, we would like to once again just pronounce our solidarity with other grad students. And I'm hoping that everyone here has seen how much labor and how much of our time kind of went into this.
Okay, I'm gonna slow this down. I don't have that much stamina or something. So I wanted to thank you again and thank all graduate students. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. And just wanted to say that we've been talking for 2 days here about translation. We've been hearing different languages. We've been hearing German, French, Spanish, Chinese, Mandarin, Arabic, Korean, Italian, and even Globish. So what we wanted to say, our vocation as graduate students was the ends of translation. And I wanted to maybe list a number of words and key words that we've been hearing in every panel, okay? So the untranslatable, translatable, both, language, of course, house, related to that, homeland, related to that, estancia, that I think Aaron said, prison, so prison house, theory, sometimes alone, sometimes as in opposition to practice, thinking, thought, critique, politics, commodity, imperialism, race, naming, proper name, violence. I think it's the last panel. Time, so past, future, present, and then heritage and inheritance, right? So that's from the whole 2 days. So what we did as we were organizing this symposium was that we asked our distinguished panelists to respond to our vocation, to that phrase, the ends of translation. What was this phrase suggesting to them, and what can they say about that? So we will be presenting them, they will speak, and then we're gonna carry out the conversation for a little bit, and then we will open it up to the audience. So if you want to start presenting.
Yeah. Okay. After those adrenaline-filled first words, I will also try to slow down and time it. So we will just introduce our 3 panelists before they each give their papers. So first, I introduce Emily Apter. You may have heard this already. Emily Apter is Silva Professor for French and Comparative Literature and Chair of Comparative Literature at New York University. Her most recent books include Unexceptional Politics on Obstruction, Impasse, and the Impolitic, Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, Dictionary of Untranslatables, A Philosophical Lexicon, co-edited with Barbara Cassin, Jacques Lezra, and Michael Wood, and The Translation Zone, a new comparative literature. She is currently finishing a book titled What is Just Translation, which takes up questions of translation and law, sexual safety, and transmediality. Her essays have appeared in October, PMLA, Comparative Literature, Art Journal, Third Text, Paragraph, Boundary 2, Art Forum, and Critical Inquiry. In 2019, she was the Daimler Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. In 2017 to 18, she served as president of the American Comparative Literature Association. In fall 2014, she was a Humanities Council Fellow at Princeton University. And in 2003 to 2004, she was a Guggenheim Fellowship recipient.
Okay, I'll be presenting Jacques Lezra. He's professor of Spanish at the University of California, Riverside, where he teaches classes on Spanish and Latin American literature, culture, and philosophy. His most recent books are República Salvaje, de la naturaleza de las cosas, on the nature of Marx's things, and Untranslating Machines, a genealogy of the ends of global thought. He is the author of works of Cervantes and Wild Materialism, The Ethic of Terror, and The Modern Republic. With Emily Apter and Michael Wood, he is a co-editor of Dictionary of Untranslatables.
And then last, but certainly not least, is Peggy Kamuf. She is Professor Emerita of French and Comparative Literature here at USC, where she was one of the founders of the Comparative Studies in Literature and Culture PhD program. Her principal work is on literary theory, and her latest book is Literature and the Remains of the Death Penalty, published with Fordham University Press in 2019. She has translated many works by Jacques Derrida and Hélène Cixous, most recently Cixous' Osnabrück Station to Jerusalem, which won the French Voices Award from the French Embassy in 2019. She's been the director of the Derrida Seminars Translation Project for the last 12 years and is co-director of the Seminars of Jacques Derrida at the University of Chicago Press. And of course, I would also like to mention that Peggy Kamuf will be teaching the Introduction to Translation Studies seminar in the fall semester of 2020.
So I'm wearing this device. You can not hear me. It's not my fault. It's the device's fault. Thank you very much to the organizers, to colleagues and friends here for the opportunity to think with you about the urgent and rather arcane topic of the ends of translation. I would like to understand that in two ways, ends of translation. We undertake a translation with an end in mind, a view, a purpose, a goal. For example, mechanical translation, or technical translation, literary translation, the view to commercial purposes, to say, nursing, to care, etc. We have a goal in mind, we call that the end of our translation, and it regulates and to a large extent determines the kind of translation we'll be doing. Having an end in mind for your translation seems to be constitutively necessary for that translation to occur. We wouldn't want to start off the translation without knowing what it was for. Or we might, but it might happen, but we wouldn't want it to happen. So that would be one sense of the notion of an end of translation. There are actually maybe three of these. The other end of translation is, well, you start translating a poem by Góngora or something like this, and you say, I don't like it, I don't like it, I don't like it. And one day you say, it's over. It's finished. So, a physical ending to translation. But the third, I think, is the more interesting one, which pertains to the status of the imagined goal or intention of a translation. About this kind of end of translation, that is, the translation that you undertake with an end in mind, you want to ask, how is it itself presented as something to be translated? How is the end translated? How do I communicate the goal or the end or the telos of the translation. It has a slightly different status from the image that you have of what you're doing, but it's connected. Whatever it is that I'm doing when I begin translating, I must be able to translate as some part of the translation. Some of you will hear in the background an echo of Benjamin on translation. I was thinking about this, and it struck me that the two senses of the end as goal and the end as something which is communicable, an image of the goal that needs to be translated and inscribed, as it were, in the translation, enter into kind of conflict. That is part of what we refer to as untranslatability in the more general condition, but also as the provocation of any translation. The ground upon which we translate. That is, if my end in translating were absolutely translatable, and if you knew what I sought to translate, and if indeed I could translate to myself my ends in translating, then I could notionally accomplish my ends and my goals, or at least I would know how I'd fallen short, and so would you. It's because the image of my end in translation doesn't square with my goal in translating that translation continues to occur, that I have that constant itch, and that the ending of a translation, that is the moment at which I declare the translation to be over, is not a theoretical but a practical one. It's a matter of exhaustion. It's an axiom of exhaustion rather than an axiom of cognition or rationality. It can't be derived from what I'm translating, but it's derived from the incongruity between the end of translation, its technical goal, and the translatability of that technical goal. Now, this is a fairly abstract way to put it, so let me give you a single example of this. I yesterday was talking at a competing institution about Foucault, and the example that came to me for this at the competing institution was from King Lear. And so I want to stay with that, just to keep a kind of thematic coherence between competing institutions, so we can translate amongst each other.
You can say UCLA.
No, I can't. It's because they've got 3 cases of coronavirus. If I say the words, everyone will be infected in this room. Jeez. Okay. The laughter minutes I get back later. So this is from the very end of the play. You'll remember that the catastrophe of the play is one of mismatches and mistimings. Cordelia is the great thing of us forgot. She's off stage and gets strangled by Edmund and by the captain on Edmund's orders, and Lear kind of marches in too late and kills the guy who had strangled Cordelia, and then he re-enters at the end too late, right? Bearing her famously in his arms, saying, "Howl, howl, 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 all your men of stones, had I your tongues and eyes, I'd use them so that heaven's all should crack. She's gone forever. I know when one is dead and one lives. She's dead on earth. Lend me a looking glass. If that her breath and mist or stain the stone, why then she lives." And Kent, the faithful servant, says, "Is this the promised end?" And Albany, and Edgar, who is the replacement who will come into the place of Lear at the end, says, "Or is it the image of that horror?" The promised end, image of that horror. What Kent means by the promised end is the apocalypse. He also means, within the structure of the play, is this really what the tragedy was going for? Weren't we supposed to be in a position that the tragedy would produce a little bit of a resurrection of hope, of possibility? Couldn't we at least have turned the first tragedy of Lear into a moment of salvation with him marrying his living Cordelia? No. The promised end is not that, but we don't even know whether it's the promised end or the image of that horror. Now this is too much for Spanish ears. at least 19th century Spanish ears. And so the 1886 translation does the following job with this extraordinary passage. And listen to what it does with this complicated play on end as finality, but also as apocalypse, as the goal of the play, etc. It says like this. First, it doesn't say how, it says son de mármol vuestros corazones y de hierro vuestros ojos. Si yo tuviese vuestras voces, rompería como el hilo la bóveda celestial. La he perdido para siempre. Oh, ya sé distinguir una persona viva de la muerta. Miradla, insensible como la tierra. Dadme un espejo. Si su aliento lo empaña, aún vivirá. Can't. Era este el éxito prometido a nuestra esperanza. Albany isn't even there. Esta pluma se agita. They've killed off the image of that horror. They've killed off the notion of end and turned it into éxito. Éxito is merely success. Was this the success we were promised? We were promised success. Success immediately curtails the possibilities of the concept of end. It is a glaring mistranslation that captures only one of the senses of what was promised at the beginning of the play as a possible end. The French do a bit better. I won't make any comments about national stuff here. Elle est morte comme la terre, prêtez-moi un miroir, si son haleine en obscurcit ou en ternit la surface, alors elle vivrait dans le cœur. 4. Est-ce donc la fin du monde? Is this the end of the world? Albany is brought back from the dead. Que tout tombe et s'arrête. That's kind of cool. That everything fall and stop. Que tout tombe et s'arrête, that's a translation of fall and cease. Edgar is gone again. He's not there. The image of that horror is gone. Oh no, I'm wrong. Edgar says, l'image de l'abomination de la désolation. The image of abomination and desolation. It's very cool. So, what has happened in the difference between the promised end and the image of that horror? The promised end is entirely the domain of possibility, the domain of the promise. The image of the horror is entirely the foreclosure of that horror as a promise or as a positive outcome. Shakespeare leaves the question undecided. Do we have a promised end which includes a possible positive outcome? We were promised a possible positive outcome. Or is this that we see the image or the representation of that horror, which could have been the positive outcome, that is the end, or simply the apocalypse or close to the apocalypse? This undecidability in the English is not subject to translation into either the Spanish, glaringly not in the Spanish, and not to the same degree in the French either. Which is a way of saying that in the process of mistranslating, something about that original is not caught, which is a banal thing to say, except that here, Shakespeare is resolutely reflecting on the mode of translation of end into the language of the living. How is the end translated into the language of the living, and how can it have an effect on the language of the living? And it's translated into the language of the living or the surviving better in the modality of the undecidable. You can't decide whether what comes as the apocalypse in the good sense or in the bad sense. That indecision is the signature of translation in modernity. And it's the way in which we produce more translations. It's a signature of the untranslatable in the modern project of translation.
So next, okay, great. I'm going to be a little bit more. Is my thing on? I don't think so.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Now you can hear.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Well, thanks. Again, a pleasure to be here on my second day here. And listening to the introductions, of course, I'm reminded that we worked on this massive Ori project called the Dictionary of Untranslatables, and we were, for a while, a bit of a roadshow about that. But of course, this is a large part of where my whole approach to theorizing in untranslatables, which is in some ways a kind of development of Castell's idea of philosophizing in languages, languaging philosophy, or if we were to stay with Derrida, justicing language as a form of translational practice. These are some of the things that came out of this project, and maybe in the discussion we can come back to that. And I also must turn to my right to this extraordinary project. I don't know if you're planning to talk about it, Peggy, or how you would even begin to. I mean, this project of translating Derrida, translating seminars, talk about translation interminable, and the way you worked with both, in a sense, creating a text in the French out of seminar transcripts. You've spoken of the difficulty sometimes of just determining what is an original, and it gets us back into thinking that there really is no such thing as an original. And I'm not going to haul out all of Benjamin on this. It really is sometimes part of the detective work of the constitutive and the foundational of any kind of source text, any kind of origin of a text or a language. So I hope that in our discussion afterwards it will be a kind of three-way, because I see in some ways the kind of pivotal work, the labor of translation that goes into a rigorous equipe, and the labor of translation that we as a team working on this dictionary project for 6 years, often with me yelling at him, and vice versa.
No, never.
And also having moments of complete euphoria, as when we had a group with Balibar and company, and suddenly the mise en abîme of translation, the sense of whoa, or simple things like how do you take a term that seems fairly straightforward? Do you translate it as an entry word in the English edition, keeping it as untranslatable? Do you translate it? It's this kind of translation interminable that I think in some ways jives with this idea of an axiom of exhaustibility. And the other thing that came of this process for me, which was kind of astonishing since I'm not a professional translator, was the fact that I became, as a theorist of translating, I wanted to completely shake up the field and say, it's not about just fidelity to the original, and it seemed like a kind of staid field with some wonderful people in it, but it wasn't a source of theory. In fact, it's Derrida who I think is, along with many, a great theorist of translation in practice and in theory. But I turned into a hard-ass normative translator working on this text, and the law of translation against my own desire for translatability as something open-ended were in complete opposition with each other. So, and I think this is something that one has to be prepared for. Is this a kind of schizoanalysis, a bifurcated practice that on the one hand it opens out when it becomes collaborative work, it becomes a kind of pedagogy that we're all engaged in, and then the task at hand, the task of the translator in the most mundane sense, the publisher has to have it. It's time to stop theorizing. It's time to look over the work of a translator and say, that's right and that's wrong. All the things that I'm against, there I was. So I just have to kind of throw that out there. In terms of my own thinking about the ends of translation, For me, and we talked about this a little bit in the discussion yesterday, I've used the phrase often as political philology. We were discussing, I've done a chapter of a book on this question of trigger and trigger warnings and what is behind that. I'm interested in the words of today, the language that we live in. If you do a survey of the terms for refugee or person in transit or in flight or person without papers, across languages, that's when you begin to understand there is no word that works. There is no name that is not exclusionary and violent for a subject in such a state. And again, many people have theorized this, I think of the seminal work of Etienne Balibar, but it's theorizing in languages that gives you, I think, a certain insight, a special kind of comprehension of untranslatability as a condition of life and of existence and its fragilities in border situations that is extremely palpable. And sometimes it's very practical and pragmatic. It's in the way legal systems impose language tests, citizenship tests, and all manner of things like this. But so, and now I think we're in an area where all kinds of behavior around sociality, sociability, there are different forms of effective communication that are very culturally grounded, that are in a sense invisible translation, and that are being shut down by a kind of legal language that is, it may be in some ways for a greater good, but it becomes harming and exclusionary. For example, if safety in the workplace is defined in ways that are very culturally oriented to a certain legalistic mode of interaction on the part of white people. And so there's a whole kind of layer, that meta level of language as it now becomes a form of regulation in the workplace, in human interactions. So as I mentioned briefly yesterday, terms like toxicity, safety, triggering, self-defense, all of these words, I think, have to be critically revisited. And in that sense, I embark on a kind of political philology that begins always with some very simple step, which is to see what happens in other languages. I've done the same kind of work in the first terms around gender, and that's just an obvious one. It's so vastly and extraordinarily open-ended, and if anything, I think it's brought us to an era of what I think of as living in the trans. And we can talk in discussion about how all the different ways that can go, but I think there's, in the attention to questions around pronomial positionality and denomination, interpolation, the way grammar interpolates subjects, the way different cultural practices define gender categories, sometimes through poetry, sometimes through performance. All of these things are part of, for me, the ends of translation. I don't make a clear distinction between translation as a literature, a practice coming out of translating great works of literature or philosophy or thought, and the sort of language of politics in the everyday. That's what I would say. So for me, a kind of political philology has become a sort of working way of life, if not a precise method. I'm going to list 4 things and then maybe linger on one. Translation, I think of as a modal operator of transmedial apperception and transontology. That's a total mouthful, not even going to get into it, but we can come back to that. I'm teaching a course on transontologies and revisiting phenomenology to the extent that I'm looking at orientations, perceptions, directionalities, orientating, and that's, in a sense, part of a kind of sense of a life world. that affects the ontology of the subject, that affects how we, and it is a slight polemic about identities, which I feel are often important politically, but they can be very restrictive as interpolative strategies. So that this would be one area. I'm moving it into cultural practice. I'm very interested in, I could talk quite a bit about this now. I just got a grant to do some collaborative research project on knowledge alphabets. What is a unit of translatability? What is an alphabet in terms of alphanumeracy, the digital unit, the script? Belly was on a panel with me recently in MLA about on alphabetic memes, and I've just done a recent article on memes as a viral currency, as a kind of language of political literacy. And this, of course, gets us also into questions around machine translation, which I know Jacques has thought about too, and with programs like Smart Compose that are writing programs that are extensions in a sense of a machine translation where how you write is being translated through algorithms and it writes for you. There's a wonderful recent New Yorker article about a guy who said he allowed them to run the program for writing on Smart Compose for New Yorker article. He says, yeah, got kind of uncomfortably close to how I would write my New Yorker article. And that gets us into the Brave New World kind of stuff, but we can't ignore this. This is a condition of relating to what Catherine Hales calls the cognitive non-conscious. You don't have to go into sort of sci-fi notions of the machinic Frankenstein, but there is some way, as philosophers like Chalmers and others have said, that the cognitive non-conscious is a kind of ghostly accompaniment. It's a kind of prosthetic accompaniment, and I think when you have prosthetic tools like compose programs, or we see increasingly that when we type, the words get filled in for us, or we almost have to override now more and more as a daily activity. And this is a condition of translatability and a form of technical reason, or new uses of instrumental reason that are really part of our everyday life. I don't want to go on too long, but I also could digress. In thinking about how intelligence as such is morphing. There's an interesting preface by Kathleen Malibu's translator, Carolyn Shred, her name is, on intelligence, and translation is something that has a kind of epigenetic quality. It takes from the environment and it has its own kind of momentum, so we could come back to that too. And I'm going to end on something a little bit in homage to Toni Morrison. I've been thinking a little bit in some seminars about the idea of reparative translation. I think there's a lot of fascinating thinking that's come out of trauma studies in addition to other places around, I call it the labor of recovery from some of the wounds of universalisms, and from what Toni Morrison called the sore thumb. She identified that with the pain of giving up, this is a quote from her, giving up a word that was racially resonant and figuratively logical for one that was only the latter, that is, only logical, because my original last word was so clearly disjunctive, a jarring note combining as it did two functions that were linguistically incompatible, except when signaling racial exoticism. So the right word presented itself and had to be discarded. And I'm very interested in, I call that the decisionism of translation. Lydia Davis, the poet and author and translator, has some wonderful examples in her journal of translation of the perfect word presented itself. It coincided, and it could not be used. It could not be used, and then she goes through the reasons why. And yet these words, they hover there. The one that got away, the perfect translation that could not be used. It's almost like, again, this kind of ghostly shadow operation. And I feel like this is part of our labor as translators. We're constantly talking to those perfect things that have to be told quietly to retire themselves, to go away or come back another time. And yet, they always linger. They're somehow part of the invisible layer of translation that is there but not there. I was also thinking this resonates a bit with Felwine Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy's Restituer le patrimoine africain, which is not so much an appeal to empty Western art collections, which is how people have interpreted it, as an argument for changing the basic terms by which Europe deals with its colonial past and the politics of heritage appropriation. And I just will signal, by way of conclusion, the politics of restitution crystallized in the legally binding articles of the post-apartheid South African Constitution, restoring 11 African languages to official recognition. And we discovered that Derrida frames this momentous event as a translation issue that brought out the importance of the word Ubuntu, a Zulu Nguni Bantu word for humanity. It was assigned special currency by Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu as a term of pardon, compassion, non-vengeance, and non-victimization in the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, citing the incident of a woman who testifies in translation that, quote, no government can pardon, only I can, and I'm not ready to. Derrida underscores that for restitution to take place, there must first be restitution of the woman's native tongue. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Well, I think I'm going to be redundant, superfluous. After listening to my two friends and fellow translators, I'm redundant in that, as Nora explained, the kind of prompt for this panel was to think about that phrase, ends of translation, what does it suggest to you? And the first thing that popped into my mind was endless and endlessness. And I think Jacques talked about this, and Emily as well. So, as I say, redundant. And I think there are endless ways we could talk about the endlessness of translation. And I think over these several days, we've heard so many contexts in which perhaps it doesn't occur to you at first to understand it in terms of translation, but you've done such terrific work reframing those contexts so that we can hear it, understand it in terms of translation. So, as I say, there are endless ways to talk about endless translation. I'm going to just talk about 3 of them, and they're fairly obvious and things you've thought about, and it's more from kind of that practical angle that Jacques alluded to. So, first one, and it's somewhat in the sense that Walter Benjamin meant when he observed in his famous essay that we've been alluding to a lot, The Task of the Translator, that, I quote Benjamin, the important work never find their chosen translators at the time of their origin. As a case in point, consider the translations of Constance Garnett. She was an English woman who was the first translator of Dostoevsky and Chekhov into English. And in the course of her life, she translated some 70 volumes of the greatest Russian literature of the 19th century, Tolstoy, Turgenev, Ostrovsky, as well as Dostoevsky and Chekhov, and others. She began translating after studying Russian. She was a very English middle-class lady, although from an educated background, her family were educators. But after studying Russian for only 3 years, Russian is a monstrously difficult language, as you may know. And it is reported that whenever she came across a passage she couldn't understand, she just skipped it. And Nabokov, Vladimir Nabokov, said that Garnett's translations were, quoting Nabokov, dry and flat and always unbearably demure. That's the middle classness. By the way, Nabokov, who was a self-translator too, at some point in his career, he was no less forgiving of his own translation, at least ironically, or perhaps in false modesty, his own translation, verse translation, of Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, at which he compared in a pair of sonnets. He compared his translation to dove droppings on the great poet's monument. And these pair of sonnets, which are, the title is, I think, On Translating Pushkin's Onegin. They begin, what is translation? On a platter, a poet's pale and glaring head, a parrot's screech, a monkey's chatter, and profanation of the dead. So rather harsh. But Benjamin speaks of the chosen translator of a work, the erwählte Übersetzer, thereby implying that great works have merely to wait, and their chosen translators will arrive sooner or later, usually later. And for a thinker who is so alert to the dynamic of history, this seems a somewhat surprising assertion, as if what he calls in that essay, and we've already referred to this, the Überleben, the afterlife, or the Survie, the survival of the literary work, in which translation plays such an important part, as if that afterlife came to a halt when, at least in one language, when the chosen translator, like the Messiah, arrived. But perhaps some wishful thinking has intruded here in Benjamin's essay, in this essay that, after all, was written as a preface to Benjamin's own translation into German. The first translation into German, but not the last, of Baudelaire's Tableau Parisien. So that's the first way. It brings me to the second understanding of endless translation. Thomas Mann's great novel, Der Zauberberg, The Magic Mountain, was published in 1924. 3 years later, a translation into English was published by an American woman named Helen Tracy Lowe Porter, hyphenated last name, who would go on to translate all of Mann's fiction. And in 1924, 1929, so 5 years after The Magic Mountain, Mann won the Nobel Prize for Literature. So Lowe Porter's translations were often compared to Constance Garnett's, unfairly, I believe, although they have since been criticized rather harshly by Mann scholars. And a fun fact, for what it's worth, Lo Porter is the great-grandmother of Boris Johnson.
Who spent much of his childhood at the Maison Française at NYU.
Another fun fact.
Since we're doing them.
Yes, you never know what you're going to learn. Well, a few months ago, and this is a confession I'm making in public, I began reading, and this is the confessional part of it, for the first time, The Magic Mountain, in the version that had been on my bookshelves for a very long time. This is what you can do in retirement. Read what's on your bookshelf. And it was Lo Porter's translation. And I was very quickly caught up by it. Anyone who's read The Magic, just about anyone, probably. I know some people who don't like it. Understand. I was very quickly caught up in it. But then I was almost halfway through, and it's very long. And a friend pointed out to me that there was another, and she thought it was a better translation in English. So I promptly had it Amazoned to my door and continued reading in this newer translation by John Edwin Woods. It was done in 1996. And I then experienced a remarkable shift in my level of engagement with this. At times, it's a very esoteric novel. And I gained in particular a significantly heightened sense of connection with the characters, who were no longer on the edge of allegory or caricature as they had seemed to be in my initial reading, or the reading of the initial translation, but they were beings who might indeed have lived and spoken like that. And so one might wonder, has Thomas Mann's great novel found its chosen translator, in English at least, in Benjamin's phrase? Yes, perhaps, but only for a window of time in which I happen, fortunately, to exist. Mann's work is barely a century old, and if it is destined to survive, to live on in its Überleben, then another age, another century, another sensibility, which cannot be anticipated, will demand and produce, I do not doubt, we must not doubt, another as yet unimaginable translation in English. I have to keep adding that because, of course, great texts like this are translated in many languages. So, endless translation is also a measure of inevitable, unforeseeable historical transformation, no less than a measure of my finitude. Which brings me to the third understanding of endless translation. My finitude as a translator, an inescapable tradition, alas, dictates that the task is endless. And this is where I'm being redundant with what Jacques was just saying, but must come to an end for various reasons. And whenever I pick up a published translation I've done, I find countless ways to improve on it. And I do not doubt that other readers do the same. And this is not so much, what I'm saying now is not so much or what I'm describing is not so much the trials of Sisyphus, and more like rolling a stone up a mountain that keeps growing as you approach the top. It's as if aspects of the work being translated lay hidden until you turned your back. But of course, that is an alibi. That's the translator's alibi, because they were there in plain sight all along, just like Poe's purloined letter. And I'm not airing here a lament or complaint about the frustrations of the translator's lot. On the contrary, even, I believe there would be little to interest me in the act of translation if the work in question did not endlessly resist submitting to all the efforts to render a version of it in another language. if, in other words, translation were simply possible rather than impossible. I'm going to say impossible instead of untranslatable, since that's become a red flag. And I have said this, I have said just that. That is, I would not be interested in translating it if it were simply possible. On more than one occasion, when asked about translating in particular, isn't that impossible? People ask, and I reply, usually something like, yes, of course, which is why I keep doing it. Although, alas, not endlessly. Thanks.
I have another fun fact.
Okay, say it.
Okay.
About Boris Johnson.
No, about Constance Garnett. Constance Garnett was a role played memorably by Meryl Streep
Oh my goodness.
in a play called The Idiot's Karamazov
Oh,
by
yeah.
Chris Durang and Albert Emerita
Was
in
that in the New Yorker
1975.
article? That was in the New
Was
Yorker
it?
article about the new.
Oh, I didn't know that. Anyway, yeah, there you go.
Yes, because it's
I
talking
remember
about,
that.
I think.
She comes on stage and she says, I am Constance Garnett, eminent translatrix from the barbaric tongues or.
Well, thank you for those responses and fun facts also. And I think they were really beautiful. I'm happy that we did this final panel. And I'm thinking here, I'm glad that the end evoked endless responses and that endlessness that I think is important here. And I'm thinking also how the afterlife or the survival of the work that is definitely there when we think of translation is a work here. So we wanted to give you the chance to respond to each other if you want, and then also think about that violence that's been evoked today in maybe, of course, the ends of translation. It's very apocalyptic, and we're living in a very apocalyptic moment at this very moment in history. So I wonder if that apocalyptic is at play here also in translation. But then the violence that translation itself can introduce to a text, right? Like what happens when you, with the text that you are translating, is it destroyed? Is it destroying a different time? For example, you were talking about two different moments of Thomas Mann translations. So is one replacing the other? Or what's happening there with temporality? And this is a question for all of you. So yeah, you can respond to each other and then.
I don't know if I should say this because it risks sounding like
Feedback.
feedback. Is that?
Probably you're all on.
Yeah, I think we should not be on.
Is that for the recording?
Fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so I started to say, maybe I shouldn't say this, and I'm going to do it. And this was a comment I made to Mahmoud while we were walking over here, in response to his really stunning presentation of the Kurdish, Syrian Kurdish, thank you, poet. Because Mahmoud put in his title, The Wound of Displacement, as part of his title. And and this is the risky part of what I'm about to say, which is I may sound like I'm relativizing somehow violence, which is a violent thing to do. And yet, and this is what I said to Mahmoud, and it made a connection to me for, his paper made a connection for me to a text of, or to a number of places in Alain Sixou's work, where it's that figure of wound, or not figure simply, but at least when it gets spoken, it's figural, of wound, blessure in French, to which she attributes all writing. All writing comes from wound, or trauma, if you like, since you mentioned trauma studies. And I think trauma, wound, violence, therefore, is, dare I say, and here's the, please don't run me out of town on the rail, but here's the risky part, a kind of universal experience, and indeed it is experience. I mean, experience, Derrida writes someplace, I think it's actually in the text he wrote, one of the places is in the text he wrote after 9/11, that was published. It was done as an interview, but it was a written text, and refers to this very idea that experience is traumatic. And indeed, if you go into the word, right, it is crossing the perimeter. It is, and the same word for danger is there in experience. It's peril, and the perimeter, and experiere is that breaching of the protective, and that's how Freud, of course, talks about trauma in his famous text. What's his famous text?
The one we can't remember.
Beyond the pleasure principle. On, of course, dealing there in part with the aftermath of World War I and these traumas that started manifesting in all kinds of psychopathologies, and he was trying to understand it. But that's how Freud describes what happens. And of course, Kathy Kamuf, as most of you no doubt know, has written about that as this breaching of an experience that the consciousness does not have the time to anticipate. So it's a temporal disjunction or dislocation that in the aftermath, the unconscious or the psyche in general keeps trying to catch up with this traumatic event, and of course cannot. But to come back to what Derrida wrote after 9/11, is to generalize this to the very condition of experience, that if nothing can break into my kind of protective barrier, and I'm kind of, maybe this goes to things you're thinking about too, with I don't know, the job security or workplace security, safety, and safety. But if nothing can break into my interior, if I remain kind of absolutely without contact to anything, right? I'm basically dead.
So I would just,
or at least so totally kind of anesthetized. And without any possibility of experience. Sorry, that was a lot of.
Can I propose?
You just want to use our microphone and pass it and switch cameras on?
No, I'll turn mine off.
I had just to piggyback on Peggy's comments and to think about reparation and wounding as two seemingly antithetical functions or ends in translation. I mean, it would seem as though the reparative function of translation is to pay back for a wound and to compensate for a wound in the present of a wound in the past, and to make whole and to restore. But I think that what you're suggesting, and what I take also from Emily's suggestion, is that there is actually not an opposition, and certainly not a kind of complementarity or a therapeutic relation between restitution and wounding, restitution to wound, because every translation, at the level of the theory and philosophy of translation, every translation is the mark of a wound and produces a wound. But also, juridically, if it's a real restitution, it has to wound. Right? The subject making the restitution has to feel it as a loss, a lack, it seems to me. Otherwise, it's not restitutive justice, it's redistributive justice. A restitution depends on my loss, my lack, and my willingness to give something up in the face of a wound in the past. That is, a wound for a wound. It's a kind of lex talionis structure there. And that's something that I think translation can show us. A restitutive translation doesn't just make stuff good. It makes an incision in the world of languages that is itself a kind of wound.
So I would say that some of these reflections on reparative translation came out of this. I was asked to comment on a book called Plinke by a South African writer, Sofonia Machabe Mfoken. This was a book published in 1962, which was around the time of the Sharpeville riots, and he wrote a book about his heart, living heart. It's very poetic, but it's not exclusively political. And the timing is strange, so it just never was translated, even though he became well known for a subsequent book. And this is so in a sense what is reparative, and I think the fact that this book is all constructed around an organ of a heart, which made me think of Nancy's intrus and the heart transplant, is that there are books that fall silent or, in a sense, are not allowed to survive or live until something later. But you read it now, and its political reparativeness, so to speak, is in its resonance and in the way in which the organ of the heart as an organ of pathos and relationality is evoked in sometimes using very strange language and terms from Sesotho, which can't be directly rendered. So you're entered into a kind of idiomaticity of pathos of the heart. And the time for this book is now. Simon B. Candy's preface to it and the publication of it is now. Now is the time of this book, and it becomes a form of reparative translation. And I think without getting too sort of, great chain of being about it, there is something about relationality in translation that is reparative and affirmative. And for example, I've been looking recently at the over-translation of Rimbaud's Une saison en enfer, Season in Hell, that by a vegan, anarcho-eco-activist writer in Australia named John Kinsella. And he bases his hyper-translation, where it's all about the wreckage of ecology that's in this, it's actually astonishingly there in Rimbaud's text, but never been brought out. And he uses anachronisms and things that are, but he stays within something of, and it's a, he does a transformation of a Delmore Schwartz 1930 translation of Rimbaud's A Season in Hell. So he works somewhat from the French, which he's fluent in, but it's, there's a third term, which is the Delmore Schwartz, which takes him part way to where he wants to be. So it's this kind of eco-political translation that takes its inspiration from something that was already attuned. So these terms, pathos, resonance, attunement, and relationality seem to me to be part of the interminability of translation in the most productive sense.
Wow. On the note of endlessness, I'm holding in my hand not only my handwritten notes from this now, but also like questions that we communally came up with in a reading group as grad students, since we read work by each of you three. And before we open it up to the audience, I will just interject with one maybe large question that I feel like connects to so much of what all three of you just talked about, because I'm kind of wondering about if you, Professor Apter, talk about political philology, and I love that concept, and I'm then just kind of thinking about the place of affect in translation, because in the Dictionary of Untranslatables, in the introduction to this, we have a quote that says, love seems to be that which repositions oneself in the world, right? But then you also, in the list of theses in the dictionary, call translation an Oedipal assault on the mother tongue, right? So then we could move into psychoanalysis if we wanted to, but we don't have to. But for me, then, that sort of like becomes a larger question about affect and ethics in translation, and maybe I'm kind of wondering if you have any thoughts on how this might connect to maybe a sense of the sacred, because in one of the papers this morning, someone talked about religious script, and we've heard this in other translation, like I've read this many times, and in the seminars that we're taking for the certificate, many texts, like for many writers in translation theory, it seems like a departure point sort of seems to be the sacred script of like the Arabic of the Quran or Hebrew of the Torah, right? And then of course, since in your keynote yesterday, you spoke about Jameson's use of Max Weber, about the Protestant ethic of capitalism, which of course talks about Christianity and Protestantism in there, and then we have Martin Luther translating the Holy Bible to German to make it more accessible. So to me, there seems to be an interesting through line or link between, I guess, affect, spirituality, and language that seems to be in the margins, like religion seems to always kind of be hanging out on the side, but I've never really heard that addressed directly. So I was just wondering if maybe there's anything you'd like to speak to in terms of the place of the sacred and or affect in translation or in political philology.
Okay. So the history of translation is full of extremely violent and morbid instances of what happens to translators when they translate sacred texts. The first translations into English of the Bible, both, I get them mixed up, Wycliffe was first and Tyndale was second. They were both burned at the stake. So, and I'm sure in all the different contexts you can think of, in, maybe during the Inquisition, this is the way in which then Christianity becomes a colonizing force and is part of, in a sense, translation genocide. You know, killing sacred texts or in the countries that are subject to conquest. So it's not just part of the history of proselytism. It's almost, one wants to say, something that links to the designation of a text as untranslatable because sacred. And this becomes part of foundational nationalisms or ethno-religious identifications in group psychology, mass psychology, all of it. So immensely complex, but it just would start by a simple historical point that death by translation is part of the history of translation. And then the other things you're talking about are immensely complex. It's very hard to wade into this conversation for me because you start immediately getting mired in cliches which many people working in religion and anthropology, ethnography, no longer use. They eschew this, which is the secular sacred binary. It's been in many disciplines almost thrown out the window. And yet I think it endures in the humanities because texts have been historically marked as sacred, and then of course the whole notion that literature is simply the secular sacred. That's what it is. And these are texts you live by. There's no question that they perform some form of I think, politically for me, the way to deal with Trumpism is to read certain kinds of texts. I feel my resilience is boosted by literature. I've seen students turn to working on protest literature around the world. Literature has that function that is, in fact, perhaps therapeutic and religious in some way, and if we define that in a completely open-ended way. But then there are these historical instances like that are just fascinating to study, and tracing some of the connections, as you just alluded to, which I wish we could do more. I wish we could take out our passages of that translation of the Iron Cage and go through all the different biblical references, the Bunyan references, the way in which a translation story comes out of a sort of whole kind of pietistic practice or an institutional commandment, an injunction to overcome sin, to find the path, and then it gets grafted onto sociological theory and the ends of capitalism. And it's a fascinating story, but the translation is crucial at every step, because each time it moves to a different language, sometimes the theological resonances shift, and that's part of the fun of this, but it is a huge issue. And affect we could talk about forever. The affective translation is really interesting.
Okay then I suggest we open it up. You may have noticed that the acoustics in this room are kind of complicated, so we have a volunteer, Adam, who will come around with a microphone to the people that we point to, so please do not speak before you were handed the microphone. And also, since I know that those of us from the reading group have so many questions, please try to keep it short. We have 26 minutes. Not that I'm strict about timekeeping or anything, but we do have 26 minutes. And also, just from experience, from grad student experience, and I know this was commented on yesterday, if you find yourself with a comment and a question, please save the comment for conversation at the Max Kade Institute later, and ask only the question now, if we may ask. Thank you.
So, Erin, Ben.
Can we start with graduate student questions, and I'll go?
I think you're fine.
Okay. Cole, you had your hand up. Do you want to?
Thank you all for a great talk. I guess I should start just to say that I am not experienced in translation theory, so I'm sort of taking this in my own way. But this question of translation, not just between languages, but from affect to language, is really interesting to me. Right, like the Capra talks about, you feel what you cannot represent, you represent what you cannot feel. So I'm interested about what translation might have to do with acting out or working through, potentially, right, as acts of trying to address this split between affect and language. And then, Dr. Apter, you talked about these situations in which people are in thinking around citizenship are sort of forced to translate. And I was thinking about sort of compulsive spaces of translating trauma as like asylum seekers, refugees, and how the ends of translation, that decisionism in a different context from what you were talking about, becomes more important than translating what actually happened, right? That in fact, for many people seeking asylum, they have to translate a story that's going to successfully speak to normative ideas of what a victim in this particular context should be saying, rather than translating their actual experience or their actual identity or their actual sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I guess.
I think we can collect more questions and then you can respond. So there are 2 questions in here. No, sorry.
Thank you so much for being here. This is so cool for me to hear you all speak to each other. I have a short question that I think is actually quite complicated. But something that's always interested me is this question of untranslatability, which I know sort of proliferates into these offshoot terms of untranslatables with a lowercase u, or the untranslatable with a capital U. And I'm wondering if you could speak to your own understandings of these terms, how they engage with one another. Obviously, like Dr. Apter, you've written about this a lot in your own work, but I'm wondering if, knowing each other's work too, if you could sort of dialogue about how you all sort of understand this idea of untranslatability and how that converses with one another. And also just think about this idea of untranslatability as a broader term that gets thrown around a lot, but no one's really in agreement about what it means. So if you could just speak to that a little bit more, that would be great.
Yeah. One more question and then we end.
Here you go.
Yeah, kind of to go off that, I guess, I think something with untranslatability that comes up is like the idea of the archive. So something I've been thinking about is like Sylvia Hartman's like Venus in 2 Acts, where she talks about the black slave girl being the subject that has like continuously been left out of the archive, and kind of like makes up a story about Venus, the slave girl, that represents the subject that does not actually like have a written story. So something that I'm thinking about in terms of translation and untranslatability is like the ways in which the subject might not just be not translatable, but actually is unable to be untranslatable because she has not existed in any archive. And so I guess my question is like, what is at stake, right, in some sort of like either, I don't know if it's a politics or ethics of translation, or like what might be differences between like untranslatability and like the unknown.
So for the first very dense and interesting question, I think that one place to give it concreteness is to look at how, Freud's case studies come often out of translating. So the working through the analysis, and when you think of the Wolfman and all of the languages, right? The Russian, French, the governess who was in English, and the kind of puns that occur, the false friends that then become these tweaks of the unconscious and embark, they become their own language, right? But it's all about learning how to read the symptoms. And it's not just the tongue, the parapraxis, it's also, in fact, very often multilingualism in the therapy situation between the analyst and analysand. And I also think about another fascinating context. There's been some work on this by Françoise Vergès and others of the Fanon's case studies, which everyone talks about his theory, but not so much about the actual case studies that he writes up, and that they're kind of considered appendices. But they're really, really interesting, especially when you bear in mind that he didn't have Arabic. He was being sent on behalf of the French to work in psychiatric situations with alienés, right? And he had a translator there. So there was another level of mediation where everything's being translated. And I come across this over and over again. These are part of the backstories of how something comes to be. I was very interested in what happened when Spitzer and Auerbach first went to Istanbul in the 30s. And but what no one really talks about is that even though Spitzer mastered a little bit of Turkish, he was being translated in many cases. Sometimes they used a Euro language, but they had quite a few Turkish students, and there was someone often translating. So this is part of, in a sense, the politics of translation for me, is to investigate archivally or through a kind of research this hidden layer of how something like the legacy of colonial psychopathology and its revisionist account in Fanon's work for race studies today is inflected by this other history, this very little studied history of translation, and that so it's part of both the symptom and the cure. The talking cure is about translating, so I would just mention that. And for the second one, I'll begin to open it up to Jacques and to Peggy about untranslatability and what it means. It's a can of worms, but one thing that I've had arguments with people like David Bellows is that his position is that everything is what he calls effable. There is no ineffability, and I get that, but I also think that there are, we were discussing it a little bit yesterday, there are there are cultural functions of the translational interdiction that have to be understood not just as some, and I'm interested in the conditions of when refusing access to translatability as a kind of colonial entitlement become functional. It's context specific. It's not absolute. I can't sort of wheel out, this is the untranslatable. It's very context specific. It's not good or bad. It functions in certain ways, in certain contexts. So in that sense, I think there are uses for untranslatability. There are uses also within the remobilization and repurposing of certain kinds of hermeneutic traditions that want to preserve and activate this idea of a secret, of a veiled truth that cannot be accessed, and it's very much part of hermeneutical thinking that there isn't an end. So that's another long conversation. I think it's also something very bound up with my own criticisms of world literature, as everything is translatable and you go into a sort of new model of literary studies which we are called on to do because we do want to diversify curriculum and expose people to other cultures, absolutely. I'm not against that. But the problem is, I think as teachers, we have to bring in some sort of Fremdung effect, some kind of, no, you're not just getting it. Let people hear the French, the Spanish, the German, the Arabic, the Japanese. Let people encounter the palpable materiality of languages as not already in English. And as we move into this machine translation moment where it becomes easier and easier for people to cut corners, this is, I think, without being in adopting a language of cultural salvage and rescue, because there is, in fact, there is a phenomenon of language extinction. Languages are dying, just like resources and species. They are dying by the day, by the year. There is a really, really terrifying kind of phenomenon, especially affecting indigenous languages, that is their disappearance. And there are some very interesting renewed projects. I came across one about recovering indigenous languages in the state of New York, in Manhattan. So, I mean, this is, I think, part of maybe rethinking comparative indigenous studies is the way language would. But it can fall into, you know, like saving languages, and that's a whole other missionary posture that I feel like you want to avoid. So these are some of the issues to talk about. The other is the one that maybe Jacques wants to pick up on, which is ontological nationalisms that embed themselves in languages. So on the one hand, you want to protect people's sense of having their language and not having it violated. On the other, there's a whole anti-capitalist critique to be made of this possessiveness, which leads to ethno-nationalist claims of all kinds. And so in that sense, I turn into somebody who is very much a comparatist, understood in the sense of outside national language possession or capture. I mean, Piketty is now advocating for a transnational economy, and that would be the only way to solve questions of radical equality. And so this might be something to think about. I think Complit had it from the beginning as a discipline, this idea of what is its basic kind of raison d'etre. It's to be outside of nationalisms. They're coming out of World War II, and what they call primal nationalism is the problem. Well, now look at the era we're in. So there's this tension, I think, between language having and as something that is profoundly important to a sense, without getting too Oedipal about Muttersprache and all of that, and mother tongue, but there's something profoundly ontologically important about that. At the same time, the way it is nationalized and weaponized, that is, I think, something we have to kind of keep a rigorous comparativist attitude, and untranslatability in that sense, I think, for me anyway, is a way of warding off certain kinds of ontological nationalisms in language. Last question, why don't we pause there as we're
It's always, it's always pushing us to disagree, which I like. But I think that, I'm not sure where the disagreement falls. It falls in different
trying to
places.
disagree now.
No, I'm not. So I think that one of the places where I stress something different from both Cassin and Apter in my thinking about untranslatability is this. I think of the couple, translatability, untranslatability, as historically transient and determined and specific and mobile couplet. Doesn't mean the same to talk about untranslatability under certain economic, social, and environmental conditions as in others, relations, in some languages, in other languages, and so on. It's a highly definite and highly distinct couplet. The era that we're living in is one in which the notion of translatability and untranslatability is overdetermined by a political economic moment. We can call globalization, we can call it the last gasps of liberalism, all the difference of determinants. One of the things that's involved in it is a conception of flow, a conception of how value is invested in objects, including linguistic objects, in transient and circulating objects. That's quite specific to the 20th and 21st century. It's very different from the conception of circulation and of value that obtained in the 19th century, and for the same reason, the conception of translatability, untranslatability in the 19th century would not be the same as in the 20th and 21st century. So given that, you'll see a kind of conflict between that, which is a highly historical and quite, you could even say, materialistic description of what translatability and untranslatability might be, and the claims that I made in my first presentation, in which I talked about untranslatability being the name for the difference between the two types of ends in the process of translation. That seems to be a claim that could go back to the first text and will last forever. And I'm ready to assume that kind of contradiction between a highly historical materialist description of the couplet translatability, untranslatability on one side, and then on the other side, this description of a untranslatability as actually part of the structure of enunciation that I was giving you at first. I don't think that either Peggy or Emily would disagree with anything that I just said. I certainly hope not. But I tend to use a slightly different lexicon. The lexicon of political economy, the lexicon of value theory to approach the question. I do want to come back, however, to the wonderful question about the archive and about the issue of what happens, or what difference there might be between untranslatability and something, you have to determine what it is, that doesn't even reach the level of the couplet translatability, untranslatability. Right? Something that doesn't have the property of experience. It has no positivity because it doesn't fit into cognitive schemes that are normative, because it isn't part of what counts as language. Right? I have two inclinations there. Inclination one is to think that that's actually the general condition of experience. Right? But my second inclination is to say, Jacques, you can't talk about the general condition of experience. You have to talk about the general condition of experience as hypothesized, as constructed at a certain moment by a certain class of people for certain ends and things like this. What I would want to do is keep those two propositions together. Right? Think of all experience, in as much as experience is a wound, as having the characteristic that it's always not quite at the level of entering the archive. And then the second one that says that experience of not quite being at the level of entering the archive is a historically determined experience conditioned by different regimes of power and different forms of access to language and forms of exclusion of access to language. So keeping the two things together would be my unhappy proposition.
Well, I'm afraid I always kind of come back to thinking through Derrida on questions of translation in general. And of course, the figure of the reality of untranslatability is pretty much everywhere in his work. Right now, I'm working on one of his seminars from the mid-90s on hospitality. And several of you in the room we've had a reading group for a couple of years on these seminars. So you know perhaps what I'm about to say, but there are several places in that seminar, particularly in the early sessions, where every time he kind of comes across a question of translation or that poses a problem of translation, he will say something like, or write something like, translation basically the same issue, the same problem as hospitality. Hospitality is a question of translation. Translation is an issue of hospitality. I think that was also some of the points that were being made. Oh well, he's gone. But about the language in which the asylum seeker has to tell his or her story and make it understandable to the host, right? The potential host. And there's another point when he asks, which is more hospitable, to speak the other's language or to expect him or her, the guest, to speak the host's language? I mean, you could argue both, right? And on this, well, on this issue of untranslatability more generally, I do recur to what for me remains an absolutely touchstone text of Derrida's on the problem of translation, which is Plato's Pharmacy, and where there's this Greek term, pharmakon, which is untranslatable. And by that, I mean, there are lots of translations of it, you can translate it, but the point is that what one cannot translate into any other language except classical Greek is the absolute ambiguity and shifting and the way in which the term can mean both a thing and its opposite. And so that, it's not that there aren't translations for anything, virtually. It's that economy. It's a question of economy, that you have this one word in a language that economically, that is, without needing more than one word, says at least two things. So that's the problem of the untranslatable. Pharmakon is untranslatable because we have to choose if you translate it into French or German or English, usually, right? Whereas in Greek, it floats, right? There between its opposing possibilities. The last thing I would say is that it's in that text, which is a text from 1968, where he writes famously, well, I've made it famous anyway, I keep repeating it, that the question of translation is the question of the very passage into philosophy. Meaning by that, it's the formation of the philosophical concept as not tied to one language or another, which is like the what is it now, 2 or 3 millennial quest of philosophy, to be able to do philosophy without language, without a language, but in a universal kind of mind meld, right? In which we all just think the same thing and know what everybody means without having to pass through this really messy medium of language. We're just, and so it's the question of the very passage into philosophy. That you have to pass through language, you have to pass through translation.
Which they call philosophy of language.
Pardon me?
And they call that philosophy of language.
And they call that philosophy of language.
The
Exactly.
enemy of language is philosophy of language.
Anyway, those are just.
I had just something apropos of that. So Jacques and I have worked a lot on the, there's a political concepts journal collective, and one of the interesting things is how to make philosophical certain terms that had no traction. And this is one that caught my eye. So the example, and this is in the dictionary of untranslatables, vergüenza, a Spanish word denoting shame and modesty that fails to appear in standard encyclopedias of philosophy. In contrast to French vergogne, more narrowly associated in contemporary parlance with legal protocols of accusation and judgment, vergüenza maintains a link to ancient honor codes modeled on heroic characters who make good on their word. The expression, correct pronunciation, vergüenza ajena, is traced to the Greek ainos, meaning reverence, awe, respect, shame, self-respect, the opposite of that which causes shame or scandal. Ainos and nemesis are paired in Homer and Hesiod and central to evolving concepts of conscience, to the social expression of public indignation and moral outrage, to calls for justice and the condemnation of hubris. So the term vergüenza, a term that circulates in the idiomatic commons of memes, by the way, there's one called K, vergüenza, it's a meme. What a shame, just meaning like, too bad, is no longer peripheral to the philosophical canon, this little word. It becomes one of its fundaments, a pillar like the Greek and Latin concepts of shame and guilt, on which modern constructs of the public sphere are built. This is my deduction from some comments in the entry, that's not directly in the entry, but this making philosophical of bits of grammar or expressions that are often quotidian. And, okay, so you can link it to this Greek heritage and then but you don't have to go that way. I mean, that's one of the ways. But the point is that there's such hierarchy about what philosophy is, and that's just what you were saying. There were so many, and the thing about turning these philosophical, transparent, concepts for all time back into languaging messes, I think is really been part of the working method, right?
Yeah. Do I have a second?
Vergüenza, yes, a second.
Those of you who are assiduous readers of the vocabulary of philosophy, the cassette on the dictionary of untranslatables, will know that there's a whole string of entries in which national languages are characterized as very philosophical. English, German, Italian, French, Spanish, and the specific philosophical character of each one of these is offered in those. They are horrendous.
It's the worst part.
We
wanted to get rid of them.
It's shameful.
So in other words, it's Greek. They have an entry on Greek, on French, on Spanish.
Yeah, and they will characterize what is it about the Greek language that makes it particularly philosophical? What is it about French? Its clarity, its
that was bad use.
That was disgusting. The Spanish one, we've got sed and estat, so we have different conceptions of being. It's like,
the French one now by you?
Yeah, well, that's it. That's why it's so horrible. No, I don't mean that.
You do that.
That's good. We have to finish. So we have a last question that Eric doesn't want to ask. Oh, so you can keep going. No, you can do the last question.
Maybe because I didn't ask this question yesterday.
So first of all, thanks to the three of you, Peggy, Emily, and Jacques. It was a really, really wonderful closing panel, because these things can kind of go a number of ways, as I'm sure you've seen. And what struck me listening to you was, you know, in the way that we got to hear from so many wonderful graduate student presenters today, who are really beginning to ask all these really big questions and taking really huge risks in doing that in public. I think it's really inspiring to hear from scholars who have been thinking about these issues for a number of years and are not kind of resting comfortably upon their laurels and saying something that they could have said 10 or 20 years ago, but really thinking kind of newly about the questions that are coming up and taking risks in that sense as well. So I wanted to say that because I really appreciated that risk and danger came up, especially in this final discussion, because the question that I had for Emily yesterday had to do with what seemed to be an equivalence between kind of transparency and the almost kind of totalitarian demand for transparency, which you link to exposure. So a condition of being transparent or demanding transparency would be linked to a demand for exposure. And exposure is really the notion that has been really helpful for me, kind of from Levinas in thinking about ethical responsibility. And I wonder if, just thinking, I've been thinking about the different methods that you're each performing. And I won't go into that right now, but we can talk about it later. But I wonder if one method that we can think about is a method of, reading, instead of, let's say we're not translating, but we're reading translations. We have the opportunity to read, to expose one text to another, as perhaps a translator does, but we have the sort of luxury as readers, as literary critics, of not having to just choose one word, but really read text in parallel as one, say, text exposes its finitude precisely, but also its potential only in that kind of simultaneous reading. So I guess I just wanted to hear a little bit more about really what all three of you thought about sort of the risk and danger that we're kind of trying to avoid or condemn, or maybe is an object of critique, but then on the other hand, a kind of risk or danger exposure that might allow us to think through translation and with translation.
I'll take the rest. Yeah.
I'll just say something very briefly and hand it off, which is that how to locate, I mean, so that hardcore appropriation for digital times of the Iron Cage was that the all-around access and public performance on social media, this sort of Instagramization of everyday life, means it is an iron cage too. It's the maximization of opportunities for surveillance, for tracking, for this incredible language. Talk about a language that's burgeoned of being canceled or having someone stash receipts and that they record you and then pull it out. And this is a whole new economy of existence. This is absolutely a whole new economy. And the language is non-incidental. So I think the exposure metaphor goes in so many directions, but it is that leaving yourself exposed is also something brave. You know, it's a form of overcoming a barrier of intimacy, of non-intimacy, and taking that risk. It's a politics of friendship. And so on some effective level, it seems to me, the way it all comes back to translation in some way, but I don't have a ready formula for it. All I can say in my last sentence here is that I've wanted to have a conversation with the two people sitting next to me for years, given their own work in translation theory and translation practice and deconstruction, to do something that this maybe connects to the archival question. I think that we are in an interesting period of doing archival studies of translations, as I think Peggy's presentation was about that, but I would be personally very interested in doing a kind of history, a reconstructive history of the relationship between translation theory and deconstruction.
Yeah, that would be cool. So that's not what I was going to talk about, but I sign up. I'll sign on to that. Yeah. That way we can go back to Corsica. So, what I would say is that as pedagogues, as people in the classroom, we have a great opportunity that's protected by the institutional boundaries of exposing and abusing the exposure of translations to each other to produce effects and knowledges in our students. This, I think, is something that we should build into our practice in the classroom. One should never teach, even in a class in which one is teaching in the language of the text. Say that I'm teaching Shakespeare, I would want to bring in translations of Shakespeare from different moments to show what happens in the 19th century when the Spaniards translate Lear and the French translate Lear. That tells us something, not just about Lear, that would be a kind of essentializing advice. It's nice to know stuff about Lear, but about the way in which texts are historically determined and conditioned, and it would also tell us something about the hierarchies of language communication at different moments. So why is it that I'm using a French translation and a Spanish translation? Well, because I can pull those off of Google Docs much more easily, right? So it's a whole conceptualization of mediation is permitted that way. So I want to say that. I'd also want to say that exposure in that sense, the exposing of one thing to another thing, is what you might call the special case of exposure in general in languages, which begins with our capacity to expose English to itself, if we wanted to say that, right? What would that mean? Well, it would mean a number of different things, but one of them would be to say, well, this is not a coherent field. It's not normativized or normativizable field. It's the expression of and the archaeological residual conglomerate of a bunch of different practices, languages, dialects that register the battles between peoples and institutions over years. If we can do that and disassemble the unity of the English language that we're using, then we're going very far towards disassembling the unity of the institutions that protect things like the purity of the English language, the sovereignty of one class that uses a certain kind of language and not another. So, and that I think is a task. That's a task, and you can call that deconstruction, or you can call it critique, or but in any event, or you can call it exposure, which I think is very nice.
Okay, then thank you again to our three panelists.